Hey there, it's Renessa Boley Layne, and I want to welcome you to another conversation on creating your perfect work. We are in the middle of our Love and Work Summit. So if you've missed any part of this series, make sure that you take some time, go back, catch up on what's resonating with you. Because whether you are married, single, coupled up, dating, craving love, or running as far away from love as you possibly can, there is something for you in this series. So, in today's conversation, we are going to talk about the psychology of sex and building sexual confidence. And so, your knee jerk reaction to this conversation might indicate just how much you need this conversation. So, if you recoiled in horror, or if you blushed in shame or clutched your pearls, so to speak, then this might be such an amazing conversation for you. The bedroom is where otherwise powerful women can feel less empowered. And in subtle, hidden ways that can threaten your confidence, it can threaten your joy, the feeling of liberation that you experience in other areas of your life beyond the bedroom, in your career and your business and your mission and all of that. And so today's guest just might set you free in some ways. And so the dynamic woman that is sharing the screen with me today is none other than Dr. Jacqueline Sherman, aka Dr. Jack. She is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's an intimacy coach. She's a relationship expert based in Jacksonville, Florida. She's passionate about helping women build confidence and teaching couples all over the world how to have better relationships and intentional intimacy. And so in 2022, she released her Sex Formation cards, which are the first sexual wellness card deck for women. And the deck helps women to boost their sexual confidence and enhance their intimacy by developing a practice of sexual, or by developing a practical sexual care practice. Let me get that right. And so here's what I appreciate about Dr. Jack. I think that she turns what could be a very uncomfortable conversation for women into a dialogue that's safe, that's appropriate, that's honoring, and that's exciting. And so she goes beyond tools and techniques, and tools and techniques are good. So you get some tools and techniques for her, but she drives home the psychology of sex and intimacy so that women can flourish and thrive in every part of their life. And I appreciate that about her. And with that, I just want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
All righty. So, you often say, as I've learned more about your work, you often say that the brain is our biggest sex organ and that sex starts in the mind. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think that this is something that just does not feel innate to us. So I like to scream it from the rooftops because it's so important. I think that really within our culture, we have been conditioned to believe that sex is something that's just supposed to happen. It's supposed to be spontaneous. Our desire is supposed to be spontaneous. And we forget about how powerful our mindset is to our relationship to sex. This is something that
Hmm.
we're not talking about enough.
Yeah.
So oftentimes what I see is a lot of women with shame, with
Yeah.
guilt, with embarrassment around their desire.
Hmm.
And at the root of that, there are some really unhealthy sexual scripts that they've downloaded. So these are mindset blocks and ways that they think about sex that are
Hmm.
really holding them back from the liberation that they truly deserve.
Got it. So, and I'm glad that you mentioned sexual scripts because I want to take a deep dive into that in a moment. But you started out as a licensed psychologist, and we all get licensed psychologists. That is a deep dive from intimacy expert and all of that. So how did you go down the road of teaching sex and intimacy?
Yeah, so really I turned my own pain into purpose.
Okay.
So I share very transparently that I experienced a miscarriage several years back,
Okay.
and it really changed my sex life. My husband and I had a very thriving sex life beforehand, and afterwards, my relationship with my body, the way that we communicated around sex, and the thoughts that I was having regarding who I was as a sexual being were truly holding me back from having the sex that I
Interesting.
deserve. And so when I really started to take a look at how I could help my own relationship, I looked for resources, and all of them were very external and not
Yeah.
necessarily what I needed in my healing process. So I started doing some of the work and developing some of the tools and the ways of thinking about sex that really helped my own marriage.
Hmm.
And once that helped my marriage, then I started really having a conversation with more women. It started small with friends and family and asking women, what are your thoughts around sex?
Hmm.
And what I found is that there were some constant themes around shame,
Hmm.
around fear,
Hmm.
around, not necessarily having the autonomy and the permission to be able to explore in ways that they really wanted to. And these
Hmm.
themes were very consistent. There was also a lot of body image concerns.
Hmm.
And so I then knew from my own experience and the experiences of others that this mindset piece is something that we're really missing. And a lot of times,
Hmm.
we're looking for toys and other things that are
Hmm.
outside of our body to
Hmm.
really help spice up our sex life. But where it really starts is here in our
Hmm.
brain.
Yeah. I love the fact that even earlier on in the conversation, you you talk about, women are they're you're expected, you think it's just supposed to work out, you get married, you do your thing, and you're like, well, certainly we're gonna have, chemistry, and the chemistry and all that is there. The attraction is there. People aren't together if that attraction isn't there. However, intimacy is it's so multifaceted, and people are bringing their own baggage, they're bringing belief systems, they're bringing shame and guilt, and they're bringing conditioning, and the male and the female, everybody's bringing stuff to the table. And so what we think should be this natural biological, connection isn't always the case. And so I'm so glad that you're bringing light to the conversation so that folks can feel validated, like, okay, I'm not the only one. I'm not broken. I'm not dysfunctional. It's not weird that I, feel this way or feel uncomfortable, because it's not conversations that we tend to have as women, or we don't always have them in the healthiest way. And so there's all kinds of elements to that. So I appreciate that you're bringing them up. One of the things that comes to mind is this idea that a lot of women don't know what they like. And so if you don't know what you like, you can't communicate that. And even if you have an idea of what you like, then there is this, how do I communicate that? And so there's all this going on. But you talk about this idea of sexual scripts and beliefs that keep women from being sexually liberated, either in figuring out what they want or how to communicate it. Let's talk through some of those, because I think there would be some value in kind of shining light on that. So let's talk through those scripts and how do they impact women consciously and unconsciously.
Yeah, so excellent question. And I think that the most common script that I have come across, and it's very, very persistent within the community of women that I work with, as well as friends and relatives, is that sex is for male pleasure.
Okay.
And I think that regardless of your sexual orientation, this is likely a script that you have downloaded at some part of your life, because the way that we are socialized in this country and oftentimes in the Western Hemisphere in general is under that, patriarchal system that really prioritizes male pleasure. And so a lot of times the women that I work with are coming to me and they're feeling like sex is something that they want to check off of a
Hmm.
to-do list because it's not for them anyway, right?
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of pain in that. There's a lot of
Yeah.
shame that surrounds that, because really, women are just as deserving of pleasure, right? It is everyone's birthright to be able to receive pleasure, and sex can be such an intimate, wonderful space to experience with someone else. But I think that when you are showing up to perform versus to
Mm.
receive pleasure, you're putting yourself in a different category, in a different box. And to your earlier point on understanding what turns you on, it's hard to get to a space of understanding that when the focus of pleasure is on somebody else, right?
Mm.
Especially for women. So I think that that is the most common script that I see. And it's interesting because until I really allow women to come to that conclusion to get there, that that's the thought that's holding them back, they don't even realize it.
Mhm, mhm.
So it can be extremely freeing to be able to release that thought.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. It's interesting because I'm always looking for, what are the parallels? Because sometimes there's the thought that how we do anything is how we do everything, which isn't always the case, but there's certainly parallels, right? And so how we can show up in our intimate space can be a parallel as to how we show up in the marketplace, whether it's career or business. And so when you talk about this idea of showing up to perform, I don't think many women would consciously, say, I'm showing up to perform for my partner. But when you are not necessarily getting pleasure from that, right? Then that's effectively what happens, because it's like, oh well, I could take it or leave it, actually.
Yeah.
But you are showing up for some reason, and for most women it's from a very loving place, and
Mm,
all of that. And
yeah.
so the intention is good, but when you recognize, if I'm not getting something from this, and I'm only doing this for this other individual, and then you have to deal with the aftermath of, how do I even feel about that? Especially if you're delivered and either you're not in the mood, or you're not feeling love, cheer, whatever could be going on. It translates into the marketplace as well, because oftentimes women are showing up in the marketplace to perform. You're in jobs that perhaps you don't want to be in, or you're trying to get a brass ring that don't really want, but I've got this degree, I'm 15 years into this career, that's the natural next step. And so oftentimes we go through our marketplace existence doing what we should be doing, not necessarily what we want to do. And many women come to me in my space, they have no idea what they want, or so they think. Everybody always knows, just haven't necessarily given themselves permission to verbalize and say, this is what I really want, and this is what I don't. And those parallels happen in the bedroom as well. Many women have no idea to be able to verbalize, this is what I want and this is what I don't. But I bet when you open them up, they got answers, like the
Mhm.
answers are there. And it's really navigating through that. So as people are listening, my hope is that you begin to see some parallels, or even ask yourself, are there parallels? And if the parallel isn't there, well, why am I showing up differently in the bedroom than I am in the boardroom? Like, what's the difference? Is there a belief system that's different there? Because in one space, I could be very empowered, and in the other place, I got a staff of 50, I'm this and that and the other. And then in the bedroom, I've become this mealy mouse, right? So start to just question some of those things as we're going through that conversation. Is there another script that shows up for women?
Yeah, so this one is also tied to pleasure, and it
Okay.
is that female orgasm is hard to achieve. This is
Okay.
a big one, right? And so again, when we think about how we've been socialized when it comes to sex, especially, the porn culture and everything
Mhm,
like that, orgasm is the grand finale, right?
mhm,
And so unless you're having that experience, it's not as good.
mhm.
And that's kind of like the goal that a lot of people are working towards. And so again,
Okay.
if you have this mindset that, one, there's a script that sex isn't good unless there's an orgasm, which
Mhm,
is really not true, but also that female orgasm is hard to achieve. And so again, it's going to impact one's ability to receive pleasure, ask for what you want, and then also feel like you deserve a
mhm,
certain level of pleasure. And
mhm.
a lot of times, and again, it's truly not true. I think that what happens is that we've really been the sex education that we have received has been very male focused. And
Okay.
so there's a lot of unknowns and things that we have to get curious about as women in terms of how our pleasure looks different.
Mhm,
And I think that oftentimes, because we don't have that information, we just assume my body's not able. And that
mm,
can be really discouraging to women again, and can perpetuate the idea that, well, I'm just showing up for my partner if I have a male partner because their pleasure is easier, and it's going to be what I prioritize in this moment. So there's a lot of showing up, not being present, really showing up trying to be perfect versus present.
mhm.
And what happens is we do something called spectatoring, which
Okay.
means are present in the sexual activity or experience, but you're not really there, right?
Mhm,
You're thinking about, is my partner going to orgasm? When is
mhm.
this going to be over? What's going to be for dinner? I
Mhm,
wonder what my body looks like right now. I wonder, are they being pleased? So
mhm,
there's all of these thoughts that are taking you out of the moment, which is going to then perpetuate the idea that it's going to be more difficult for you to experience an orgasm because you're in your mind and not in your body. And
mhm.
so that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Got it. What becomes the outcome of that? Right? Because when women are in that, let's say women are, those who may be listening, and somebody's in that scenario,
Mhm.
in their mind, they're doing what's right by their relationship,
Yeah.
right? It's like, okay, well, this is not my jam, but let me, you know, love up on my partner or whatever. And in the short term, okay, but over time, how does that begin? Does it begin to erode the intimacy? Does it begin to create resentment? Like, what's the long-term effect if women don't acknowledge, even if they don't know how to fix it, acknowledge that this is not quite right?
Yeah. Well, both of the things that you said come up, right? And so intimacy can definitely decrease because a lot of times, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because conversation is liberation when it comes to sex. We're not talking about it. And so when we don't talk about things in our relationship, when we harbor them, it's
Yeah,
then going to cause and create the resentment.
yeah.
Another thing that happens is that desire decreases. So your
Mhm.
libido will decrease because the sex that you're having may not be worth wanting. So I tell people to
My
think,
gosh, you said,
yeah,
oh my
yes, if it's
goodness.
not worth wanting, I mean, why would
Wow.
you desire it? So I tell women to imagine that, you had to get a babysitter, you had to, get a babysitter
Wow.
for your child, you had to get all dressed up to go out to a party. And when you got to the party, it was meh, right?
Hmm.
You didn't really enjoy the music. They had food there, the food was okay, it just really wasn't fun. You didn't have a good time. Are
Hmm.
you then going to want to put in the effort to continue to show up to that party? Like if someone invites you 6 months later, are you going to want to go? The likelihood is no. And so a lot of people are having sex that's just meh, and they're wondering why their desire is low. Your desire is going to be low for anything that wasn't good. If you go to a restaurant and the food was, a 2.5 out of 5 stars, you're not going to crave that restaurant. You're not going to crave that food. You're not going to want to go back. And
Hmm.
so thinking about sex is the same thing. If there's things about my sex life, and not saying every time you have sex, it has to be a
Yeah.
5 out of 5, like you knock it
Yeah.
out of the park and it's amazing and
Hmm.
fireworks. But generally speaking, normally, is the sex that you're having something that is desirable? If not, then that's the conversation that needs to be had. And I think that deep down, a lot of women are really avoiding that conversation because it's hard to have. And going
Hmm.
back to what you mentioned before, I don't even know what I want. So it can be hard
Hmm.
to even have the language to be able to communicate that I love you and I want to show up and be sexual with you because that's important to me and it's important to our relationship. But I'm finding that I'm not craving sex because the sex that we're having really isn't that desirable to me. And these are
Hmm.
some things that could happen that could change possibly my desire for sex. That's a really hard conversation to have.
It's a hard conversation.
And I encourage people to start with what you don't want. Oftentimes people know a lot more clearly what they do not want
Yeah.
versus what they do want. And so that's
Yeah.
oftentimes a really helpful place to start. Like, I actually really don't like it when you initiate by grabbing my breast. That
Hmm.
doesn't really feel good.
Hmm.
Perhaps instead you could, give me a kiss on the lips. That would
Hmm.
actually warm me up a whole lot better, right?
Hmm.
And so oftentimes starting with what you don't like can gain some clarity.
Interesting. Oh, we're going to talk about communication because I was like, oh, how do you have these because they're such sensitive conversations, and then you have someone else that's in the conversation whose feelings you're trying to protect and massage and so on and so forth. And so ultimately women end up, I'm going to prioritize your feelings and your, ego and all of that over my need. And then over time you just have this the scab that kind of comes over the relationship, I imagine.
Yeah.
So are there, before we jump ship, are there any more scripts that show up for you that you're like, yeah, this is something that I'm seeing, so much for women that we need to kind of unpack? So I want to get some of that out for people so that they can start to feel validated, like, oh my gosh, yes, that's me.
Mhm.
I resonate with that. Is there anything else that you're like, yep, one of these top five?
This one comes up 9 times out of 10, that my body needs to be perfect in order for me to receive pleasure. And so there's almost like this idea that I need to look a certain way in order to be desirable enough, in order to receive the pleasure that I deserve. And so it can come in different variations, but there's oftentimes a script about my body needs to look a certain way in order for my partner to want me, in
Mm-hmm,
order for me to be deserving of a certain amount of pleasure, which we
mm-hmm,
know is not true, right?
mm-hmm,
Everybody's body is deserving of love and pleasure. But I think oftentimes, again, looking at our society, there's this idealistic beauty ideal that no one can achieve, but
mm-hmm,
it's perpetuated on us in a way that can make us feel really insecure, and it can
mm-hmm.
impact our self-esteem.
Yep. And what's, again, how we do anything is how we do everything. There's parallels on the other side of this as well. You know, for lots of women, it's so fascinating. I have lots of women that come to me and they're either trying to elevate, they're trying to something, in their careers or whatnot. And when I talk to them, there's all these reasons why they're not ready for the next level, or they're not getting a seat at the table, or they're not getting opportunity. And they're coming trying to figure out, how do I get myself together in order to be ready for this opportunity? Invariably, when we dig under the hood, these are some bad women. Like, I mean, skill set, talent, ability, demonstrated achievements, the whole nine, got it all. And yet, and still, in their minds, there's something more that I need to prove before I even step my hat, put my hat in the ring. And so there's parallels. Lots of women have beautiful bodies, and then there's others of us that have whatever bodies, but the grass is always greener on the other side. Someone's got nice big, C cup breasts, and somebody, and so you're always looking for the thing that you don't have, not
Mhm.
recognizing that you bring, the person is interested in you for a reason. Let's just start there.
Yeah.
they
Oftentimes they're not complaining.
They chose you for a reason, and for the most part, they knew what you had and didn't have beforehand. Like,
Yeah.
there's some layers, right? There's some
Yeah.
layers they may not have seen, but they knew on the surface what they were getting, and they chose to, put the down payment on it and move forward. And so there's already something there where you've been chosen. And so in these places, you are being invited to then challenge the belief. Because just because we think something doesn't mean that that thing is true, right? It's my reality, but doesn't mean that it's true. Just because I experience it this way doesn't mean that it is objectively true. And so, especially when it comes to things like, body image, you get to challenge, is this true? And you
Mhm.
might have to work it through. You might have to do some mindset work, some spiritual work, some personal growth, whatever. That's fine how you get there, but at least being able to challenge and say, you know what? I don't have a better thought, but I know that this thought is not serving me. So now I'm willing to do the work to eradicate that. Because if it's happening in your intimate relationships, 9 times out of 10, there's somewhere else in your world that the same thought process, the same I'm not enoughness is showing up. And that becomes the pattern. And that's going to affect your money, your promotion, your leadership, your impact, your influence, and all the other things that are important to you as well. And so sometimes our intimate relationships give us a window into how we may be showing up in other ways that we're not recognizing. So I think that's a really, really important point. Let's go with number five, and then we'll move on to kind of conversations and such. Is there anything else where you're like, yeah, and this is showing up too?
I would say the last thing that I find that comes up, at least for the clients that I coach, is that men should initiate sex. So
Mm,
that's something that comes up. And so again, I think it's very, very interesting because, some of the women that I work with, they have been married for 5, 10 years, and they're like, I just don't see that as my role.
Mhm.
And so I think that it's really important to think about, where did you get that message from?
Mhm.
And is it serving you now? Is it helping me, or is it hurting me in terms of my relationship?
Mhm.
Because it's very interesting. I work with very high achieving women who are go getters, right? And so they go after the things that they want. They have audacity, and they are really, successful women who are not afraid to, ask for what it is that they want. But it's very interesting that in the bedroom, the dynamic shifts.
Mhm.
And so I think that being able to really kind of take back some of the authority in a
Mhm.
space like the bedroom, in a space like your intimate relationship, can really be helpful to helping you to feel holistically like I am bad and I can ask for what I want in every aspect of my life. I don't have to be limited in a certain way. And a lot of
Mhm.
times when we peel back the layers to that particular script, a lot of it may be tied to things such as religion, right?
Mhm.
Or family messaging,
Mhm.
where they were told at a very young age, like good girls don't want sex,
Mhm.
or good girls don't ask for sex, or good girls don't play with boys, that
Yep.
type of messaging, where now as an adult who is married and has a loving partner that they have consensual safe sex with, still doesn't necessarily feel comfortable initiating in that way and leaves that role to their partner.
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting about that is that there's a couple things that come to mind. Um, for your partner, men often want to feel like to initiate with them makes them feel desirable, makes them feel like it meets an emotional need for them as well. And for some women, we don't realize that that is actually a desire or need for the other person. And
Mhm.
so while perhaps they initiate most of the time or whatever, and every relationship is different dynamics. There are men who tend to be a little more passive and they're not the initiators or whatever. So, take it with a grain of salt. But the point is that oftentimes your partner is looking for that emotional exchange as well. They want to feel desired, they want to feel chased, they want to feel like when they walk into the room, you're like all sorts of excited for them as well. And so that's something to just be aware of. I think the other piece of this, and you brought it up, as you think about this conversation, we initially said, how you do anything is how you do everything, and there's often parallels. There's two ways of really thinking about this conversation if you're looking at it from a love and work perspective. If you identify with any one of these scripts for any reason, let's just say the men should initiate sex, one, and you're looking at yourself and you're saying, okay, I'm the person who tends to be more passive. The question you ask yourself, am I showing up in my life in other ways where I am not going for things, where I'm not the assertive one, where I'm not being aggressive? Why? Because then you might be able to see some patterns there and kind of get to the root of that pattern. The other side, though, is, and you brought this up, Dr. Jack, it's like you might be, you know, the baddest game in town in the marketplace. You're a negotiator, you're assertive, you get paid your worth, you're going for it. Why then are you not doing that in this area? So look at it from both angles, like, okay, if I'm doing something here, are there other patterns that are similar in the marketplace? That's one way to look at it. But then you might want to look at it as if, am I showing up here so unlike how I show up in the rest of the world? Either one of those is a telltale sign that can get you to the root of something, because your issue might not have anything to do with assertiveness, right? It could be there's some script going on as it really relates to sex and intimacy that you get to heal from, right? Otherwise, for other people, there might be a general pattern going on across the board. So there's two ways of looking at it. I want to give you a framework so that you don't get bogged down on one. But again, your intimate life can always be a window into how you're showing up in the marketplace, either by contrast or because I'm showing up in similar ways. I hope that makes sense for people, right? So you talk about, well, I'll ask this question. Some women consider themselves highly sexual. right? Or they have a very healthy sex drive and that kind of thing. And others think that they're not very sexual at all. And you started to talk a little bit about this, and I want to go into that. Or there's this belief that men are more sexual, or I just don't I have this low libido, or whatever. Generally speaking, barring medical issues, is that really true that, women have this lower sexual drive or whatever? Or are there other factors at play that impact a woman's sexuality, or this sense of, feeling frisky and blah, blah, blah?
Oh yeah, that's such a good question. So there's a lot of I really believe everything is at play, right?
Yep.
And I think that unfortunately, we have been conditioned to believe that sex is a drive and you either have it or you don't. But
Right.
that is just not true. We are all on a spectrum when it comes to our overall desire for sex. And depending upon what's going on in your life, it's going to change, right? So, for example, a lot of my clients, like after they've just had a child, their libido may be a little bit lower, right? They're navigating, being, having a new child and being a parent and what that looks like and how that changes their life, and they're adjusting. And so that's going to take a toll on your body that's going to make things look very, very different. So I tell people to think about your desire for sex as a spectrum, right? It may be high this week, and a month from now, it could be low based off of the circumstances that are happening. So I just want to normalize that for
Sure.
people. And then I also want to just educate individuals that there's two types of libidos or desire types. One is spontaneous and one is responsive. Because most women are more responsive, we get looped into having low sexual desire when that may not necessarily be the case. In fact, we may just need something different than someone who has a more spontaneous desire. So, someone with a spontaneous desire, and most men, not all, but research does show that most men identify with more of a spontaneous libido. What this means is that you could be writing an email for work, and all of a sudden you just think, oh, sex would be really nice tonight, right? Or you see something and immediately your mind goes to sex. That isn't often how a lot of women are wired. So it's more responsive, meaning that there has to be something that happens for then our mind to think, oh, I want sex. And depending upon what's going on in your relationship, so say if there's not a lot of emotional intimacy, say if you're really tired a lot of the time and you're really stressed because you have a really busy job, or you just transitioned or got a promotion, or you're taking care of young children, and you're really, really touched out. Those things are going to impact that responsiveness when it comes to your overall desire. And so a lot of times it's not that women have a low sex drive, is that they're more responsive, and the conditions that are going on in their life at the current moment are not conditions to encourage their sexual desire. And so you
Interesting.
really have to learn the differences, because women with responsive desire are going to need to be more warmed up. It's not going to necessarily come as spontaneously to them in terms of a thought. And so what that means is that there's got to be a lot of foreplay. And when I say foreplay, what I mean is every single thing that you are doing from the last time you had sex to the next time is foreplay. How you talk to your partner, the questions that you ask, are they just logistical questions, or are you all actually having deep intellectual conversations?
Mhm.
Right? What does the spiritual intimacy in the relationship look like? Are you all experiencing things together? Are you having experiential intimacy where you're doing things together that are fun and new?
Mm.
What does the physical touch look like? Do I feel like every time you're touching me that you then want sex, or is there physical intimacy? Are we spending time cuddling? Are we spending time skin to skin, just connecting and increasing our oxytocin? Are we having those moments of intimacy that are building up to the actual feelings of desire that may be necessary for someone with more of a responsive desire type? So to answer your question, it really is about learning and understand that the two different libido types are very, very different.
Mhm.
And we are socialized to think that everybody has a spontaneous libido. That is not the case.
Mhm.
Many women have a responsive desire, and therefore are going to require different needs in order to feel more turned on and connected to their desire.
I'm glad I asked that question actually. And I love the response because I think it also helps, just the response for those of you who are listening in, helps you to even understand what needs to be communicated. Like you talked earlier about the need to communicate about sex. And and I think just generally that's a difficult conversation to have for people. And they think that the communication is just about the sex act itself. Well, it's not, clearly. And so when you talk about what foreplay is, um, it's not just 3 minutes before intercourse. Like that's not, foreplay. Like, because as you said, it's foreplay is everything from the last intimate encounter to the next. And I certainly didn't see it that way. And I don't think a lot of other people see it that way. But this idea that, wow, all these different elements she talked about, intellectual conversation, touch just for touch sake, as opposed to touch like grab them by the, whatever. And so all of those different things become fodder for that conversation that you have around what you like or what you don't like. Because all of us know that there are things that there are experiences we have with our partners that make us feel more endeared to them, feel more connected to them, feel more drawn to them than others, right? And so she gave lots of different examples, and maybe going back through that and saying, okay, do I like that? Do I not? Is that really a winner for me? Is it not? Because these become kind of the talking points where you're able to say, hey, here's what I like, or here's what works for me. Because I know for me, I'm not a debater. Like I'm not one that'll sit there and just talk about, current events and politics and things like that. But I love deep, rich conversation. And I
Mhm.
don't need to have a lot of it. It could be just a short, like if you teach me something that I didn't know, or you have a, oh, that's kind of hot. Like just
Yeah.
the conversation. It doesn't have to be intellectual. We don't have to read some long Iliad book, none of that. But just the idea of being able to exchange ideas, I
Mhm.
didn't know was something that's actually quite sexy to me. Joy, laughter, silliness is actually quite sexy. And when it's absent for long periods of time, and you mentioned you have transactional conversations, lots of people can look in their relationships and say, we're in a season where all we're doing is talking about the kids. We got nothing. If it's not about the kids, and it's not about dinner, and it's not about who needs to be where at what time, we have nothing to say. That could be a clue as to why you're not feeling it. And so hopefully that answer gives you some fodder as to, oh, okay, these are elements that I can talk about. But I'd like to segue into the communication bit. Um, as you think about the conversation, scripting aside, what are elements that women should like? What should we be talking about with our partners? What are those different parts of sex and intimacy that we should be broaching the conversation about?
Yeah, so excellent question. And a piece of why I created sex formation cards was to help women, like to create a guide that would help women to have further conversations. And it's a three-step process. So step two is conversation. So there's some great questions that it takes the guessing work out of it for you. And you're able to really have these conversations. But first and foremost, one of the things that I will say is that for a lot of people, having a conversation around sex that is intentional, right? You're going into it with wanting to build better emotional intimacy, wanting to understand maybe what your partner wants or desires, wanting to communicate what you want and desire. Maybe you're wanting to redefine what intimacy means for this season of your relationship. You're going into the conversation with intentionality. Oftentimes that is not how we talk about sex. So I think that first and foremost, you want to acknowledge that this is going to be a different type of conversation. And I always tell individuals, if you haven't been having these conversations reoccurringly, then you want to give your partner a heads up, right? You don't want this to come out of the blue. What's going to happen is sex is so vulnerable that they're going to immediately get into defensive mode, or they may experience some shame or embarrassment and feel like, okay, is there something that I'm doing wrong? So I
Mhm.
think giving them a heads up, hey, I've really been, hearing some things lately. And you can even mention, I listened to the Love and Work Summit,
Mhm.
and they talked a little bit about sex and intimacy and how it's really important to relationships. And I learned a lot. I would love to set up a time to kind of talk with you about some of the things that I've learned, right? So you're
Mhm.
giving them a heads up, like
Yeah,
we're going to be having
great
these
idea.
conversations, right? So it's not coming out of left field. If it's not a regular conversation in your relationship. So that would be step one, like get the permission. Step two is when you have the conversation, you want to make sure that you are being really mindful of timing, right? So we don't want to have this conversation in the middle of sex, right? I usually say outside of the bedroom totally, not before, right before sex, not right after sex or during sex. You really want to have it at a time that feels neutral and light because again, sex is a vulnerable topic. It's one that oftentimes we don't have a lot of practice in terms of discussing. So do it over coffee, like on a Saturday morning when, maybe, the kids are out of the house, they're at, soccer practice, and it's just you two. Something like that, I would encourage. So thinking about timing is really important. Third, I would always encourage couples to think about how you can grow versus what you want to change in terms of language, right? It's much
Mm,
more
that's important.
digestible to say, I would really like the frequency of our sex life to grow. Or I would really like to expand, how much we explore in the bedroom and grow to, learn and try new things together. That type of language is oftentimes going to have your partner leaning in, getting curious and wanting to learn more versus getting, pulling back and feeling like embarrassed or shameful or like they're doing something wrong. So I always encourage, you want to approach it with how can we have a growth mindset around sex? And I also encourage people highlight what your partner is doing well, right? So even
Mhm.
if it's like, I love it when they, when we tongue kiss and when we make out like teenagers, if
Mhm.
that's what you like when it comes to overall sex and intimacy, highlight that during the conversation and encourage it to be a team approach. If there are ways that you want to grow, so say, for example, like you've noticed that you guys are having dry spells and you're not really talking about it, and, sex is something that becomes awkward, bringing that up in a way where you guys want to work together to grow in this area. And I think that remembering that sex is a team effort can be really, really helpful. And then hopefully, once you communicate in that way, your partner is one, open to hearing what you have to say, but two, also wants to be on the same team with you and wants to
Mhm.
work together to increase the intimacy and to grow. If you think about it, it's so interesting to me because, when we think about like finances, when it comes to a long-term relationship, or even like parenting, like these are areas where we know and understand that like we have to be invested and intentional about growing, or we're just going to stay where we're at, or
Yeah.
things are not going to really go well. But sex is that one area where we think it's supposed to thrive with no work.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I'm telling you, I know the movie says differently, but in real life, that does not happen.
Yeah.
And so being willing to acknowledge that, right, humbly in a loving way, I think is also something that can help to frame the conversation.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. Um, I told y'all she was going to take a very uncomfortable topic and make it so appropriate, right? Um, this is super helpful. I think super helpful for people, especially when you sandwich in or you sandwich yourself between your personal responsibility. Like every woman brings themselves into the relationship. And so some of the disconnect, if there is any, it's not just the other person. It's not even just our frequency or this or that. Sometimes, you might be bringing scripts to the party that influence how you even perceive your interactions or what your expectations are and all of those kinds of things. So I think a piece of it is always starting from within and saying, okay, what am I contributing to this dynamic here before I start getting my all my communication together and all my talking points for you?
Yes.
Yeah, we gonna grow, but really you gonna grow. It's the
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
thing.
Self-reflect first.
Yeah, so I think that's really, really valuable. So I love that your sex formation cards are really broken down into categories in that way, because then as women we get to take ownership and responsibility and accountability for the dynamic that we're putting in first. And then the other piece of it, really developing the courage and the conviction to have these tough conversations, and also be willing to have them in love, and expect that they may not go smoothly. It may not be, you know, comfortable. It might be awkward. The other person may or may not respond in the way that you hope they respond, like, oh, I'm just all on board. They've got their own scripts that they may be bringing to the table as well. And so recognize that if you're going into these conversations, know that you have the dynamic of another person who has feelings and insecurities and thought processes and belief systems and all of that, and being willing to lean in. Maybe you have to lean out and then you come back in again and
Yeah.
and you make that progress over time, because it's certainly not a one and done conversation by any means. But my hope is that you've been validated in terms of how you might feel in terms of your own sex and intimacy, and then equipped with ways of being able to address it. And so with that being said, Dr. Jack has a free gift for everybody that's listening in. And what I love about free gifts is, A, it gives you the opportunity to get great content from someone who has expertise in their space, but it also allows you to step into her ecosystem and, continue to follow her work and invest in her work and invest in her service and all that she provides to the marketplace in a great way. So with that, let us know what you got, and then we'll drive it on home.
Yes. So there's one thing that I want to say before I share the gift. One thing that I think is important to note that I didn't share is
Oh, yes.
what you just mentioned. There's so much power in owning that in the conversation. So I always tell people, be really honest. Start with, this is a awkward conversation to have. This is hard
Yeah.
for me to say. I'm not really sure if I'm using the right language, but I want to work over time to try to make this more comfortable. Like you said, it's a recurring conversation, not a one and done. So I wanted to make sure to highlight that, because I think that some people can hold that energy and feel really
Yeah.
anxious around it. There's so much power in just speaking it, because likely your partner feels the exact same way. And now you've created just so much less tension when you're having the conversation, because you've really stood in your honesty and in your truth.
No, that's beautiful. It's absolutely well said and true.
Yes, yes. So, what I have for you all, if you're listening to this conversation and you felt like it was super helpful and you want some tangible tips on how to increase your intimacy, how to have a better sex life, I have a guide that has 5 steps to having a better sex life. So it's a free guide. You can go to my website, www.drjack.co. That's www.drjac.co. You can grab that guide. It's going to have some conversation starters. So things such as fantasy. How do we navigate mindfulness when it comes to sex, meaning being outside of our head and into our body? Like, how do we create more sensuality in our experience? It's also going to give some tips on how to have better conversations around sex. So you can go grab that guide and have some conversation starters, but also some things to self-reflect on regarding some of the scripts that you may currently be holding.
Absolutely. So you'll see a link to Dr. Jack's website right below this video as well. So go straight to that link, your name, your email address. Again, stay connected to her ecosystem. You can follow her wherever she is on that website. I will give you all that kind of information as well. But thank you so much for sharing your heart, sharing your expertise, your story. It is hugely beneficial to so many women. And my hope is that many listeners, you begin to see the parallels, how I'm showing up in the bedroom, how am I showing up in the marketplace, all of those kinds of things. Those are all critical to being able to get so much of more of what we want in both our work and our life, right? With that being said, on behalf of Dr. Jack and myself, we want to wish you all well, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.